War feels like it has always existed, like it is simply what humans do, an inevitable feature of a species that competes, accumulates, and disagrees. But here is something that most people don't know. For most of human history, organized war did not exist. Not because ancient humans were peaceful, not because they were better than us, but because the conditions that make war possible simply weren't there yet. War, it turns out, is not a human instinct. It is a human invention, and like most inventions, it required specific ingredients before it could exist. Start with the oldest question in this debate. Are humans naturally violent? The answer is yes and no, and that distinction matters enormously. Individual violence is ancient. Homicide, assault, murder between individuals, or small groups over personal disputes. That goes back further than our species. Chimpanzees commit individual violence. So do many other primates. There is evidence of interpersonal violence in human skeletal remains going back hundreds of thousands of years. But individual violence is not war. War is organized, collective, sustained. It requires groups to coordinate their aggression toward another group over time. It requires planning, supply chains, leadership structures, a reason worth fighting and dying for that extends beyond personal grievance. And for most of human prehistory, none of that existed. Hunter-gatherer groups, the way humans lived for the vast majority of our existence, were small. 30 to 50 people typically. Mobile. Moving constantly to follow food sources. They had no territory in the fixed sense. They had ranges, overlapping, shifting, seasonal. When two groups encountered each other, conflict was possible. Occasional violence happened. But sustained organized warfare between groups was rare for a simple reason. There was nothing worth fighting a war over. No fixed land to claim, no stored resources to seize, no permanent settlement to defend or destroy. If two groups clashed, the simpler solution was usually to move. The landscape was large. The groups were small. Avoidance was easier than war. Then something happened that changed the equation completely. Around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, humans began farming. This single shift created every ingredient that war requires. The first ingredient was fixed territory. Farmland is not interchangeable. You spend months preparing soil, planting, waiting, investing enormous labor into a specific piece of ground. You cannot simply move when someone threatens you. That ground is your food supply, your survival. For the first time, humans had something worth defending with their lives and something worth taking by force. The second ingredient was surplus. Hunter-gatherers do not accumulate much. You carry what you own. Accumulation is a burden when you are always moving. But farmers accumulate by design: stored grain, livestock, tools, wealth that sits in one place and can be seized out. For the first time, one group could become dramatically richer than another, and for the first time, raiding that wealth became a viable strategy. Not just for individuals, for groups. Organized, planned, collective raiding of another group's stored resources. That is the economic foundation of early warfare. The third ingredient was population density. Farming supports far more people per square kilometer than hunting and gathering. Settlements grew. Groups got larger. Neighboring groups got closer. Competition for the best land became intense. And with competition came conflict, not occasional interpersonal violence. Sustained, organized, collective conflict between groups competing for the same resources. The archaeological record documents this shift with uncomfortable clarity. Before farming, skeletal evidence of violent death is relatively rare and mostly shows individual trauma. After farming begins, the evidence changes dramatically. Mass graves appear. skeletons with multiple traumatic injuries from the same event, fortifications around settlements, weapons that appeared designed not for hunting, but specifically for killing other humans efficiently. The first clear archaeological evidence of organized warfare dates to around 10,000 years ago in the Nile Valley, a site called Cemetery 117. 61 skeletons, half of them with embedded projectile points, many with multiple injuries, men, women, children, not a single violent encounter between individuals, a massacre. But resources alone do not fully explain war. Because humans have been fighting wars over things that have nothing to do with survival, honor, religion, ideology, revenge. The memory of past wrongs that happened to people who are themselves long dead. This is where the social psychology of groups becomes important. Humans are intensely tribal. The same brain that evolved to maintain loyalty to your small group also evolved to treat outsiders with suspicion. In a small hunter-gatherer band, this was manageable. Your outgroup was a few dozen people you occasionally encountered, but as groups grew larger and more organized, the tribal psychology scaled with them. The in-group loyalty that once held a band of 50 together could now hold an army of thousands together. The out-group suspicion that once made you cautious around strangers could now be weaponized into dehumanization. The ability to convince people that the group on the other side of the hill was fundamentally different. Less human. Less deserving. A legitimate target. This is not a modern phenomenon. The evidence for it appears in the earliest written records of organized warfare. Enemy soldiers described in terms that stripped them of humanity, language designed to make killing easier by making the killed feel less real. There is one more ingredient that most histories of war overlook: leadership. Individual violence requires only two people and a grievance. War requires someone to organize it, to convince hundreds or thousands of people to risk their lives for a collective goal, to coordinate movement, supply, strategy, timing. The emergence of chieftains, kings, and military commanders was not separate from the invention of war. It was part of it. War created the conditions for hierarchical leadership, and hierarchical leadership made larger, more organized, more devastating war possible. Each development enabled the other. In a world without war, there is less need for a centralized authority capable of organizing collective violence. In a world with a centralized authority, the capacity for organized collective violence grows dramatically. The two evolved together. Here is what is worth sitting with. War is not ancient. It is not a primordial feature of the human condition. It is an invention, a relatively recent one in the full span of human history. It required specific preconditions to emerge: fixed territory, surplus resources, population density, hierarchical leadership. The social psychology of tribalism applied at scale. When those ingredients came together, war followed, not because humans are inherently warlike, but because humans are extraordinarily good at organizing, at coordinating, at following leadership, at committing to collective goals. Those are the same qualities that built cities and cathedrals and hospitals and everything else humans have made. War is what happens when those qualities are aimed in a particular direction, with a particular target, and a particular story about why that target deserves what is coming. Basically, humans did not invent war because they were violent. They invented war because they were organized. And organization, it turns out, cuts both ways.